Right, I think we will get started. Welcome and thank you for joining us this evening for our webinar, Practical and Pleasing, Early 19th Century Quilts. My name is Brittany Garrett and I am the Collections and Research Public Programming Specialist here at Old Sturbridge Village. Tonight we will be discussing the evolution of quilting in New England from the late 18th century to the late 19th century, and of course we'll be using our wonderful quilt collection as our guide. And tonight, our presentation will be led by Collections Manager and Curator of Textiles, Rebecca Beall, and Program Coordinator, Jean Contino. Welcome both. Before we begin, I would like to share a land acknowledgement. Old Sturbridge Village is located on the traditional land of the Nipmuc peoples. New England and the rest of the United States consists of land expropriated from Native American peoples. We honor the land and the indigenous peoples who have stewarded it throughout the generations and continue to steward it today. So just a couple more reminders before we begin. This program is being recorded and it will be posted on our Old Sturbridge Village YouTube page, which I encourage you all to visit. There will also be a question and answer session following this discussion tonight. So I invite our live viewers to submit any questions at any point during the presentation in the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom center of your screen. And now with any further ado, I will pass things on to Rebecca.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And welcome everybody. And thank you for joining us tonight. We're really excited to bring some of our favorite quilts to you in this webinar. And I thought I would start by just kind of introducing folks who weren't familiar to our collection here at the Village. We've got a collection of about 50,000 objects, ranging from small little sewing tools all the way up to big vehicles and everything in between. So our collection really focuses on things that were made or used in New England, particularly the central, more rural areas of New England between the years of 1790 and 1840. And we do go a little bit early and a little bit past those timeframes, as you'll see in this presentation, so we can flesh out the stories that we're telling. So our quilt collection is really fantastic here at the Village, and we're really very privileged to be able to work with these quilts. We have about 220 total quilts, including pieced and whole cloth quilts, made in a variety of different materials, wool and silks and cottons, and in a huge range of sizes, from full-size bed quilts all the way down to small little cradle quilts, excuse me. But in addition to that, we also have dozens of quilted clothing pieces, from petticoats to quilted slippers and shoes. And it really is a wonderful snapshot of the sort of techniques and patterns that were common through the 18th, late 18th in particular, early 19th, and into the mid 19th century. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Jean to talk about the sort of early history of quilts here in New England.
Hello, everyone. So I'd like to start out with some of the earlier quilts in our collection. And in general, quilts were quite rare in New England in the 17th and 18th century. The majority of the quilts that we did have were imported from England and also some from India, where they were usually made by professional quilters in the upholsterer's trade. So male master quilters and their female assistants. When the women of New England began to create their own quilts, they did so in the style of their time. So a lot of them were whole cloth quilts. Quilts at this point are expensive objects of conspicuous consumption. They were displayed usually in a place of prominence, so very often in a bed found in the best room. And a best room is a combination of a parlor, living room, dining room, and also a parent's bedroom. So it is a place where your guests may be coming to attend tea, and they would also see this wonderful quilt on your bed. The fashion for patchwork quilts, which we're so familiar, begins a little bit later in America in the 1770s. And it's coming from an English origin. Usually a word that we're quite familiar with is used in a different way. So when they're speaking in the 18th century of patchwork quilts, very often they're describing a particular kind of quilt where it's a pieced mosaic created by repeating a single geometric shape, like squares or hexagons all the way through. And we have some very early examples in our collection dating back to one from 1803 made by Lucy Lance. So some of the late 18th century and early 19th century quilters used this traditional idea of woolen fabrics and quilts, but made them in contrasting colors so that they could make pieced quilts, which have some very elaborate designs of stars and zigzags, which we're going to save for another quilting talk. But I wanted to begin with this first quilt, which is a great example of an early American whole cloth quilt from the 1780s. And it's a great example for me to talk about in general how these quilts were made. So the front was often made of a purchased fabric coming in from England, which was a shiny woolen fabric called calamanco. It was a tightly spun worsted wool that was then calendared or pressed between hot metal plates. And if you look at the illustration on the left of the blue quilt, you can see some darker lines. It's where these metal plates overlapped when they were pressing. So you can see how big the plates were. This fabric really highlighted the quilting stitches, and the fabric came in a variety of weaves, including things like plain, satin, or twill, in many colors. Dark blue like this one is very common, but you'll also see bright pink, deep purples, greens, yellows, reds, and browns. And so that made a very elaborate, fancy front fabric, but it also made it expensive. And as we see on the picture at the right, the back could be very, very different. Most often they're hand-spun, hand-woven fabrics, and often dyed in a common color in yellow, like the outer fabric and the backing of this quilt. And usually it's made with local dye stuffs, things like onion skins, tansy, or goldenrod. So by having a locally dyed hand-woven fabric on the backing, it was a way to save a bit of money because the expense went into the front calamanco that was going to show. This quilt also has a couple areas with different fabrics. You can see one near the top center and then a darker blue at the bottom. And I don't know whether both of these were repairs that came in later or whether it was piecing that was done at the time the quilt was made. But another interesting feature of many of these quilts is they often had a batting inside that was made with a dyed wool, something like dyed a dark blue, or with a naturally dark wool. And it helped to avoid something we might call bearding today, where as you're sewing through the layers of the quilt, your woolen yarn or thread might pull up tufts of the lighter colored batting, and it would show on the dark surface on the top of the quilt. So this was a way to avoid that by having a dark batting. So now I'm going to turn you over to Rebecca to tell you a little bit more about this particular quilt.
So as Jean mentioned, this quilt dates to 1789, and it is the earliest officially dated quilt in our collection. It's a little bit hard to see, but the picture that we have here on the screen does say 1789 and above is AD. And really, aside from the beautiful calamanco and that conspicuous consumption, the beauty here is in the really elaborate quilting. So early on, the quilts in the early 18th century were very elaborate in their rippled feathers designs and flowers and leaves, and very intricate. By the late 18th century, it starts to take on a more geometric quality with diamond lattice and more simple feathering. This quilt, aside from the date, has a very interesting overall quatrefoil quilting design, and then that undulating feather that you can see really well in this picture. It's also interesting too, because the beauty is in the quilting design, it's actually a little bit challenging to lay out these very intricate designs. And sometimes it doesn't necessarily match up the way you might have intended it to. So the feather overlaps slightly in a few of the corners. So the pattern is beautiful and intricate, and on the bed you would never notice that small design oopsie, but it does have a few areas where the pattern does not quite match up. But again, because this is one of our early quilts and it's a dated quilt, it makes it an incredibly special addition to our collection. And the next one that Jean will talk about is another one of our early dated quilts.
And this one is one of our earliest dated pieced quilts in the collection. The green and white alternating blocks make a very stunning overall pattern. So it's a very simple 9-patch block that alternates with white squares. The quilting designs in the white squares are very interesting. They run the gamut of flowers, a cornucopia, grapes, hearts, and even a few mottos like love and friendship, content, faith, happiness. And on the slide on the left-hand side, you can see the center of the quilt where we have the initials A, T, E, and the date 1806. I also like the interesting sawtooth border around the outside, and it was bound with a woven tape. So very interesting overall pattern.
And continuing on with our early dated quilts in the collection, and going back to what Jean was talking about earlier about the idea of a mosaic or patchwork quilt. You'll hear me say this many, many times. This is one of my favorite quilts in the collection. It's a piece hexagonal quilt that was made in 1808 by a woman named Phoebe Windsor. She lived from 1786 to 1852 and lived in Johnston, Rhode Island. And she made this quilt probably around the time of her marriage to her cousin Isaac Windsor. What's really, really interesting is that in a private collection, her sister completed a very similar quilt dated just a year earlier that incorporates some of the same fabrics, a very, very similar layout, the same idea of that lovely, beautiful cotton and linen Indian print on the side. So it's really interesting to see these two quilts side by side. But what makes Phoebe's in particular really interesting is it is one of the earliest named patterns. It was known by many names in our period. So from the Ladies' Book in 1835, it was called the hexagon patchwork. Eliza Southgate wrote a letter in 1798 where she talks about some quilts and called this a geometrical piece. The American Girls book in 1831, written by Eliza Leslie, calls it the honeycomb, and oftentimes you'll hear it just called mosaic or mosaic patchwork. And of course today, as of the 20th century rather, but into the 21st century, we know it by the name Grandmother's Flower Garden. Some other early named patterns that show up, I have to say most of the names that we know and love for our quilting patterns today tend to be later in the 19th century into the 20th century in their origin. But some other early name patterns are a mariner's compass. Eliza Southgate was talking about in her letter some purloined quilts and mentioned a mariner's compass. Orange peel, Irish chain, rising star, and Job's trouble are all mentioned in 1849 in the Godey's Ladies' Book. And at the time that that was written, they listed those three in particular as being very old-fashioned patterns for that time. And as we go to the next slide, the one thing that I love about this is one of my favorite quilting techniques and piecing techniques is the English paper piecing technique, which is something that you see folks, again, bringing those traditions over with them from England. And for those of you who have never done it, it's a really wonderful way to get very precise corners and matching those shapes very precisely, but it is very time consuming. So this is a different quilt, but it's an unfinished top, so you can really see how that construction happened. The fabric is cut out and basted to, in this case, scraps of newspaper. And then that fabric is basted around those templates. And then using a whip stitch, you create your mosaic or your flowers and stitch them all together. Once the quilt top is finished, you can then take out those basting stitches and take out the papers. Most of the time you can feel the quilt and it does feel like the papers have been taken out. Occasionally you can feel a little crunch in the quilt and realize somebody either forgot to or intentionally left some paper in there. But again, it's very easy to get a nice crisp corner and a very precise shape at the expense of the more American style of running stitch, where it's a lot faster, but you lose a little bit of that precision. The next one that we have, it kind of takes a little bit of a left turn, shall we say. So all of these wonderful pieced quilts are coming out in New England. And as fabric is getting more easily available, more affordable, so that it really is much more accessible for folks to at least get some small pieces to create these wonderful, what we today would call scrap quilts. The fashion is always shifting. So especially coming out of urban areas and kind of taking that quilting to the next step. So in her book, The House Book, Eliza Leslie in 1843 mentions that patchwork quilts of old calico are only seen in inferior chambers, but they're well worth making for servants' beds. And this idea of custom buying of new calico just to cut it up into ingenious figures and what was once very fashionable has now become obsolete. Another advice book says that patchwork is not worth the candlelight to make it. But the newer trend kind of harkens back to the wool whole cloth quilts, where it's much more about, again, conspicuous consumption, and in this case, using a beautiful pillar print chintz. So a printed cotton fabric with a very highly glazed surface, and again, using probably pieced together, but creating that illusion of a whole big piece of cloth. And in this case, the design of the quilting is taking the back seat to the design of the fabric. So as you can see in the right-hand side, flipped up, we have the back of the quilt. It's a very plain white backing fabric. The quilting is done in alternating stripes of scalloped pattern with a kind of diamond grid pattern. So really the quilting is beautifully done and very neat and tidy. But on the front of the quilt, the real spectacle is that beautiful chintz fabric. So the pieced quilts do still survive quite a lot. So again, these are some of the advice books and urban fashions. That doesn't mean that everybody in New England immediately stopped some of these old traditions. So a lot of times you'll find that people in New England are still very much making some of these piece quilts. And I'll turn it over to Jean to talk about this lovely, lovely fellow.
Which makes a great tie-in to our whole cloth quilts, because you might wish to make a whole cloth quilt, but because a lot of these larger, more elaborate floral prints could be quite expensive, you might not be able to afford enough for the entire top of the quilt. So this is an option, a strip quilt. So it could be made of 2 or more alternating fabrics. They might be very similar in color, so they imitate the look of a whole cloth quilt. One of them might be a more expensive, larger print like this. The other, a locally produced printed cotton that was much less expensive, so it could save you a bit of money. Some of them are also made like this one, could have been made with scraps for the pieces, put together in a pieced pattern in between those more stylish strips. So this pattern you'll probably recognize in the modern world being called flying geese. One of the things that I really like about it is it has this very unique border on one end where the geese are flying sideways. But I also enjoy that there are many different size triangles used in this quilt, and yet the overall effect is still a very pleasing design. Our next quilt is going to be a little bit different. Another way that we might be a little bit more frugal is to take something that already exists and turn it into something else. So recycling and reuse of fabric in New England quilts is very common. In this particular quilt, the main body, which in the left-hand picture is on the left-hand side at the bottom and appears a more rosy color of red, was actually an mid-18th century quilted petticoat that a lady would wear under her gown. So the original rectangular piece of fabric was cut in half, resewn together to form a square, and then a newer piece of red fabric was put around it. The placement of this square is very different from our modern aesthetic. We would probably want to showcase the elaborate quilting of the petticoat by putting it right in the center of the quilt and then framing it with a new border of a different fabric. The other thing that I find really interesting is the back side of the quilt, which is the photograph on the right. You can see the striped section at the top left, and that is the back of this quilt or quilted petticoat that we saw in the front. So the top of the petticoat and the front had a calamanco top with that very shiny wool surface, and the back is a more simple homespun fabric that was used for the lining of the petticoat. And there are also 2 sections where you may see a small red stripe at the top. Thank you, Brittany, at the top and at the bottom, which are slits that still exist from the quilt, possibly from the waist opening and maybe an opening for a pocket so that you could reach under your quilt. And we'll talk a little more about pockets later, but you can still see the binding is visible on them. And this whole quilt was bound on all 4 sides with a red wool tape. In our next slide, we're going to be able to compare the quilt to one of those 18th century petticoats. So you can see the ornate quilting pattern at the bottom of the petticoat, which on our quilt shows up at the very bottom left-hand corner of the quilt, and then again in the middle. And it comes from a period in the 18th century when a dress might be split in the front intentionally to reveal the elaborate quilting of the petticoat underneath. When the fashion for dresses changed in the early 19th century and they became a much more straight conical profile, you'd find that these full petticoats could no longer be worn under those dresses, but their warmth and beauty could still be enjoyed by turning them into something like this wonderful bed quilt.
And tying in again to the reuse, which really is a big theme within a lot of New England things, particularly quilts. This one is a pieced 8-pointed star quilt that was made circa 1840s. And it is a really interesting quilt for a couple of reasons. It was made by Betsy Lyford Hutchins, and there's actually a paper basted to the back that has that note indicating this quilt belonged to Betsy Lyford, property of John B. Hutchins. And when it came to us, it was a donation quite a few years ago. And the person who owned it did a search for Hutchins and Lyford and came up with Old Sturbridge Village. And sure enough, we have the Lyford Hutchins cider mill as part of our experience here. And so the donor approached us and said, would you be interested in having this quilt that belonged to this farm and this person? And we said, absolutely, yes. It's in wonderful, wonderful condition. But the reused part is kind of interesting. As we're examining the quilt and looking at it, on the back, it appears to be reused linen sheets. There is a small little section where there's initials ML, which very likely stood for Betsy's mother, Mary Goodhue Lyford. Betsy married John Hutchins in 1849, so that kind of places the quilt a little bit, and they lived in Brookfield, New Hampshire. It's really a fantastic quilt, not only for that reuse, but looking at the front of it, it's very attractive. Clearly, it's got a lot of different materials in those stars. The green and blue fabric that is set between the stars probably was fairly intentionally purchased for this quilt. And the other interesting thing that you'll notice is this is our first T-shaped quilt. So it's a very distinctive shape for New England. And it is designed so that the quilt will drape nicely over the posts of a bed. This one, in the very corners, you can see a rounded out shape there where it would drape nicely around those bedposts. And just visible, you can see the original cotton ties that would have secured the quilt to the bedpost to keep it from shifting. So it really is a wonderful example of this style of quilt, and the fact that it connects so closely to a building that we have and a family that we represent here at the museum really was a wonderful addition to the village quilt collection.
This quilt, which dates somewhere between 1815 and 30, came to us from Hadley, Massachusetts, and it has large squares of printed cotton fabric, but then the other areas, which are beautiful floral embroidery of cotton and wool on cotton and linen backing, is very interesting because most likely it is reused from something else, very possibly from 18th century bed hangings, partly because of the crewel style of embroidery. And it's interesting to us for a couple of other reasons. There are places in this quilt where the embroidery itself has worn away, but it gives us a great glimpse to see the marking in pen that was done before the embroidery. So you can see how it was marked onto the backing fabric. And there are also places in the piecing where the embroidery pattern continues right into the seam of the piecing. So that also points to it being reused. It's also a very clever use of the embroidered sections where you're making the center kind of medallion out of 5 separate pieces and then using more of it as a border around the 4 sides. And it does have the T shape that Rebecca just mentioned in our previous quilt. So another great reuse of fabrics to make a beautiful quilt. And this next quilt is one that's very dear to us because it was made by Matilda Fisk, who lived right here in Sturbridge. And it's a quilting pattern that we might recognize today as the orange peel or melon patch pattern. It could well have been made from fabrics that were purchased intentionally for this quilt. But another possibility is that it could have been made from recycled cotton gowns. One lady, Sally Brown of Plymouth Notch, Vermont, wrote in her diary in October 19th, 1833, that she began to piece a bed quilt out of 2 old calico gowns. Now, we don't know that this was made out of gowns, but it is an intriguing possibility that it could have been. Another interesting tie-in to our collection is not in the form of quilts, but in the form of weaving drafts. We were very fortunate to have a collection of drafts from Peace and Patience Kirby of Dartmouth, Massachusetts, and they did weaving on their farm between 1798 and 1826. And very often their drafts have pattern names on them. One of them, called the Orring Peel, O-R-R-I-N-G-Y, which is probably supposed to be orange peel, has a very interesting shape with similar curved lines in a square to this quilting pattern, and it was used to weave an overshot coverlet. So it's another indication that perhaps this name was also associated with quilting and piecing patterns in the 19th century. It has a very tiny cutout for the T shape, which makes a very small drop. It could well have been made to fit a particular bed, which was very wide but not very tall, which also brings up a great thought with these quilts, that each one is made individually to fit a particular bed, because beds are not in a standard size like we have a regular queen or king size today. So each one is individual and unique.
Going on to the next quilt, going from a tiny little T, we have a much larger T on this one. This one is a pieced quilt, four-patch variation, probably made circa 1835 from the Wilbur family of Swansea, Massachusetts. And again, like so many of our quilts, the story behind them is really important. This one came to us as part of a very large donation of hundreds of objects, particularly textiles, from the Wilbur family, dating between the late 18th into the mid 19th century. So it really gives us a great snapshot of the textiles accumulated by one family in Massachusetts. As you can see, it's a very big, very attractive quilt. The center of the quilt is largely made up of smaller, probably scraps. But again, that beautiful orange that you see is very striking and very eye-catching. And then combined with that very strong diagonal created by lighter colored fabrics would make it a focal point on the bed. The fabric around the outside, again, was probably purchased specifically with this project in mind. Very wonderful pillar print, very, very heavily glazed. In fact, the whole quilt is really in pristine condition. It doesn't look like it has been laundered or really used much at all. It's that spectacular. And again, going back to the reuse of materials on the back, again, it appears to be possibly some reuse sheeting. And this time the initials SS, which might stand for Sarah Sherman, who was a member of the Wilbur family, indicating that it was either her quilt or reused material from her. And again, like so many of the quilts, this intricacy and the sort of visual appeal is in the fabrics that were chosen. This one has got a fairly simple but very well executed quilting design of parallel chevron lines. And it really takes a back seat again to those fabrics and that beautiful orange and that white diagonal that you get very strongly from this quilt. The next one is a quilt that is also about the same time period, again, circa 1835, very similar in its design. This one came to us from New Hampshire. Unfortunately, we don't know the maker or the family, but again, made up of possibly various scraps and pieces, again, having that beautiful blue that really pops in addition to those variegated nine patch variation, sorry about that. And again, with a nice, beautiful scalloped, probably purchased again for this quilt, edge fabric there, very large T, again, a quilt that would have been made for a particular bed. The backing on this one's interesting. It's actually a printed calico that you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, which in itself is quite attractive. And again, the quilting pattern is scalloped on the drops and just a very simple grid in the center. So it really is about those fabrics and about that design. And as we go to the next slide, one thing that I love about so many of the 19th century quilts that we have in the collection is how many times you see pieces that have been pieced within the block. So one place you might notice it in this particular one is that block right up in the top left where Brittany's got her cursor going there. So in this case, they've used the same fabric and just pieced together two small bits to make that full rectangle, and tried to match up the pattern fairly convincingly. But oftentimes you'll see completely different fabrics being used. The block right below there, I believe, is another spot that's been pieced, and they've used plaids that are the same but don't quite match up. And it's really interesting as modern quilters, we would probably, or at least I, speaking from personal experience, would be kind of hesitant to try and piece a block like that, or if I did, I'd probably try and make it match as much as I could and fussy cut it a little bit. But this happens so much throughout these early 19th century quilts, and really trying to conserve the material and stretch what you have as much as you can.
This next quilt is a very special one. It's much different than some that we've looked at. If you look at it on the surface, it is a beautiful pieced quilt with 8-pointed stars, but it has some amazing details in there. It was made by Clarissa Moore, who was from Eastford, Connecticut. And what I find really interesting is she completed this when she was 17 years old. It combines piecing techniques for those stars with theorem painting or a kind of stenciling done in the white pieces. So it really personalized the quilt. In the center are blocks, which you can see highlighted on the right-hand side of the screen, which have her name, Clarissa Moore, and then the date 1837 stenciled on them. The other part that you can see by looking at these squares is how fine and tiny the stencils were that made the floral designs around the outside of each square. Clarissa may have learned to do theorem painting either as part of her schooling. If she had gone to academy after her academic work, she might have chosen this, almost like we would have an elective today, to learn how to do theorem painting. Part of that work would also be how to make the stencils themselves. So not just designing, but creating the stencil. Another option would be she might have learned this kind of work by hand decorating tinware or chairs for other factory work in the area. The OSV collection has more than one stencil quilt. We actually have 2 additional quilts and 5 bed covers that were done with stenciling. And this is quite rare. It's found mostly in the northeastern United States. And then Rebecca has a special story to tell you about this quilt.
So we love quilts that come to us with a little bit of history and story, and Clarissa is one that certainly does. It came to us from the family, but in a slightly roundabout way. So Clarissa, as Jean mentioned, made this quilt in 1837. When she was a little bit older, she married a gentleman in Eastford by the name of Frank Homan. The two ran a farm. Unfortunately, they did not have any children. So as they were aging and realized that they needed to have some help on the farm and also some help taking care of themselves, they invited a younger couple in the area, George and Ida Beall, to come live with them, help tend the farm and help tend Clarissa and Frank. And in exchange, eventually they would inherit some of the farm and the personal property, including this quilt. And the quilt then descended in the Beall family until it came here to the museum. And as the story goes, and of course, these family stories may or may not be true, but I like to think this one might be true. So apparently Clarissa was a bit of a sweetheart, and as the Bealls were expecting their various children, with each pregnancy, Clarissa said, well, if you have a girl and you name her after me, I will give the baby $5. And 4 sons later, finally, the 5th child is a girl. She's named Edith Clarissa, and although the story does not continue, we don't know whether or not she actually received the $5. I like to think in my heart that she did. But really, the quilts themselves are beautiful and special, but the story behind them is what really makes them even more intriguing and special to us as a museum. And our next quilt is certainly in that same vein.
This very striking quilt was made by someone who also had a very interesting story. Susanna Allen Anderson Howard from Ware, Massachusetts, made this quilt. She was born in 1813, and by 1825, her mom had died, and she was helping her father to manage their household. In 1827, her father also died, so she was orphaned at 14 years old. She and her 2 brothers became wards of an uncle and went to live with their grandfather. Soon after, another uncle died, and 6 other children came to live with the family. So Susanna, as the eldest girl, very probably acted as the domestic manager or lady of the household. When her grandfather also died, she became the guardian of her 2 younger brothers. It's a very sad story, a lot of loss, but not uncommon for folks in the early 19th century to have seen this much change in their family early in their life. Fortunately, her story improved. She married Emery Howard in 1839 and probably made this quilt about the same time as her marriage. So I'm going to let Rebecca tell you a little bit more about this particular quilt.
So again, Jean mentioned her story, which makes this quilt special, but some other things that make this just one of the standout pieces in our collection is the scale of the piecing. So this quilt incorporates almost 12,000 miniature pieces. And when I say miniature, I mean incredibly small. Some of the pieces that you can see on your screen are literally the size of your pinky fingernail, to the point where I have to wonder how on earth did she hold on to them and stitch them so beautifully. The center is, again, that hexagon mosaic arranged in nice flowers and probably using that English style of paper piecing. And then the borders themselves, she's very carefully and consciously arranged these borders to give these bands around that center medallion of various different pieced blocks, probably done in that American style of a running stitch without the paper templates. There are 15 different piecing techniques, including the hexagonal, 9-patch, 8-pointed stars, and a variety of different pieced blocks that make up this whole quilt. Again, you can see it's another example of that very typical New England T shape. She definitely was playing with her colors a little bit. So again, you can see very strong bands where she has some pinks or some darks, and that white band and lighter color around the center there. And it's really a fantastic study of the different patterns and fabrics that were available to folks. Susanna lived in Ware, Massachusetts, which is just a little bit to the west of us here. Still an agricultural town, fairly rural, but lots of textile mills in and around this area meant that a lot of these fabrics were very available and very affordable. And the fact that she has collected not just a handful, but over 40 different fabrics show up in this quilt. And it really does show that rural aesthetic, love of color and pattern and that exuberance. And it really is, especially considering her life story, one of the stars of our quilt collection. What makes it really fantastic, though, is on the next slide, Jean will talk about, she made not one, but two quilts, probably around the same time in vastly different styles.
So this amazing quilt was also made by Susanna, but it's a whole cloth white work quilt with very elaborate quilting patterns. It has a central medallion, floral designs, feathers, and also a diagonal grid. The whitework quilts of this time reflect a taste that's becoming very popular for neoclassical designs, and it's popular right through the 1860s. It's something that shows the awareness of folks in New England of things like the archaeological digs that are going on in Greece and Rome at the time. And it's kind of intriguing. I think Rebecca had mentioned this earlier, but once anybody can afford the printed cottons from the local textile mills, all of a sudden the style changes in the city. So now it's going to this very white, very elegant sort of quilt, where the focus is definitely on the elaborate quilting stitches rather than the very brilliant colors and patterns that we've seen in the piece quilts. The quilting designs on these are very well executed, but imagine having to do the geometry to try and draw all of this out on the quilt. And it's something where you might be able to do it yourself, or you might actually hire a neighbor who's very good at the sketching to come in and draw the design for you in the background and then do your quilting yourself. And on this particular quilt, the T shape is also cut out rounded to fit around the bedposts as we'd seen in some of the others. So it should lay very elegantly on the bed. These whitework quilts tended to be much more highly valued than the calico quilts and not usually looked down upon as many of the pieced work were. In a probate inventory done for Francis Wheelock of Sturbridge in 1833, he had what was called a whitework counterpane, which is much like this quilt. It was valued at $5. And just as a comparison, most pieced calico quilts in the area were valued about $1 at the same time. So very much a prestige quilt, highly valued. And it's really interesting for us that someone in a small rural community like Ware would be doing both the very vibrant pieced quilt and this highly urban neoclassical style whitework quilt at the same time. And we have another stellar version to show you in our next slide.
So this is another beautiful example of a whitework quilt in our collection that was made around the same time that Susanna made hers, circa 1841, by Mrs. D. Baker, Nancy Cheever Baker. She lived in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and she actually entered this quilt into the Charitable Mechanics Association Fair of Boston. And it was so beautiful, she won the silver medal for a quilt more beautiful than any other. And really, the pictures do not do this quilt justice. It is spectacular. So like Jean was mentioning, the motifs are very much inspired by the archaeological digs and this interest in Greece and Rome and classical motifs, the white color, the grapes, laurel wreaths, cornucopias and urns. This one is very carefully drafted, and the corners really match up beautifully. The quilting designs were incredibly well executed so that the pattern flows seamlessly throughout the entire quilt. There aren't any awkward corners or mismatched areas. It's really beautifully, beautifully laid out and closely quilted. I believe in the next slide we have a line drawing because it can be a little tricky to see the white on white. But this sketch was done by one of our former curators who studied this quilt very, very much. So you can see how elegant that design is with the curvaceous leafy vines and that beautiful center medallion with all those classical motifs. So really, Nancy Baker should be incredibly proud and probably was incredibly proud of this beautiful quilt that she constructed. Our next quilt is, again, taking us even a little bit later into the 19th century, probably made circa 1850. This one came to us with an unknown maker, but probably originating in Braintree, Massachusetts. And it is, again, a lovely balanced quilt, very symmetrical. It is a combination of applique with also some stuffed work too. So those little sprigs of berries near the birds are all stuffed and have a nice texture to them. Stylized floral bouquets, and again with that sort of imagery of the urns and the flowers cascading over it. It also does have some areas of embroidery in the green stems and a little bit around the birds. So it is kind of incorporating a lot of different styles and techniques. This is something that you start to see in the mid-Atlantic, those red and green applique quilts, and are often reflecting German designs. And then that tradition and that style kind of migrates as things do and becomes popular here in New England. And really the popularity that is kind of shown in these quilts is coming from the complex shapes and the complex designs and the well laid out designs, kind of like what we saw with Mrs. D. Baker's quilt in her white work. And they definitely, in this case, are not incorporating scraps, so things that are very consciously purchased for this quilt, often found in moderate to upper income households. And unlike some of the patchwork, the white work and this style of quilt don't seem to have gotten the ire of some of the advice book authors of the period. And what's really interesting is the greens, in particular, the green in the upper right-hand corner that is being highlighted right now. That is the only spot where it's shifted to blue. So whether some of the yellow leached out or something happened to change that green over to the blue, you can see that's the area that's got a little bit of staining as well. So lots of things happening in the dye techniques as well that are allowing you to get those brilliant reds and greens, especially the single step green that's developed in 1809. Prior to that, it would be a two-step blue and yellow, and oftentimes the yellow, being a little more fugitive, would fade out and you'd end up with a very lovely shade of blue leaves instead of green leaves. So it's really interesting to take a look at this quilt, thinking about the sort of history of the colors. Our next quilt is another one that I will pass over to Jean because I know it is one of her favorites.
It is indeed. I think it's my very favorite. It has a very pleasing overall look with some interesting patterning in the printed fabrics. So the outside border is probably purchased just for this quilt, as we said, many of the others because of the amount of matching fabric. But I find it really intriguing that the striped fabric makes 3 columns but doesn't complete the fourth side. But my favorite part of this quilt is in the very center, where you may see at the top, there is a very darkened piece, which we're now seeing in the second slide. It was actually an 18th century linen pocket embroidered with silk thread. And it's something that a lady would be wearing underneath her gown and filling it with whatever she might need. And then it could be taken off and worn the next day. So rather than emptying the pocket of one dress and filling an attached pocket on another dress, you have this always packed, like keeping your purse always packed. And in these highlights, we can see down on the right-hand side, part of the center of the quilt, where Nancy Newton, the maker of our quilt, has put her name, as we often ask people to do in the modern world. But what she did is something very interesting. She gave us her birthday in 1801, but doesn't tell us when she made the quilt. So that's kind of interesting. What she actually did with that pocket is you can see the shape of the blue and white pocket in the center, that it's almost a teardrop shape. And so Nancy had squared this off and taken the bottom two sections that were wider and moved them up to the top. Yes, thank you, Brittany, right there, to make a rectangular shape that's even in the center of the quilt. And then as we go back to a picture of the overall quilt, what you can see is that she's now filled in around it to make a central rectangle and continued the same kind of pattern of embroidery from that center pocket through the entire center of the quilt. So beautiful design in the embroidery, extremely well executed, as you can see by the insert of two of the medallions that you can see, very, very fine embroidery. What is also intriguing to me, though, is that these medallions are not evenly pieced with the striped fabric. So they don't end in a square. It's actually kind of rounded off at the corner. So it makes me wonder where those came from. Were they existing or were they actually made for this pocket? Excuse me, for the quilt? And then the pocket itself obviously had some kind of sentimental attachment for Nancy. So was it her mother's, her grandmother's, her sister's pocket that had a special meaning for her? And so that she went to these great lengths to continue the design and make it the central portion of her quilt. But it is definitely one of my favorites.
And I get to interject a teeny tiny bit to highlight one of our very recent acquisitions within this past year as we're talking about Nancy Newton's fantastic quilt. This is a new pocket made by Terza Waite, who very kindly initialed it, TW, right underneath the slit there. And she married James Bowdoin in 1815, so that dates this somewhere between 1800 and 1815 based on her life dates. And she lived in New Braintree, Massachusetts. But what's really fantastic about this quilt and some of the ways that we use our textile collection, because naturally they're quite fragile and we can't always have them out on display, especially in some of the period houses that don't have light control and climate control. But we had been working with an outside designer in Texas to help create an embroidery kit that will then be hopefully soon, if it's not already, for sale in our gift store here at the museum. And so we're trying to find creative ways to allow folks to interact with some of our textiles, and in this case, be able to make a little house-size reproduction of Terza's pocket for your very own. The next quilt, kind of keeping along the lines of the stories behind the quilts. This one's a really interesting one. Again, going back a little bit to circa 1830 or so. This came to us with a history of having come down in the Arnold family of Providence, Rhode Island, and probably the Arnold family, as in relations of the infamous Benedict Arnold. And the piecing of this quilt is fairly simple, just squares, a one patch. The quilting itself on that pieced part of the quilt is also fairly simple, just a basic grid, nicely done, but again, not very intricate. The highlight of this quilt is that center medallion, which is a handkerchief, a printed handkerchief, that shows the Declaration of Independence. And so at the top, you see 3 of the founding fathers. Around the bottom are the 13 original colonies. And at the center of that handkerchief are the words to the Declaration of Independence. And what's really interesting is that the maker of this quilt quilted the pieced part very simplistically, but the handkerchief, on the other hand, has been quilted in a very detailed pattern. So around the laurel wreaths, around the original colonies and the founding fathers, it's been densely quilted. Underneath each line of the Declaration, it's also been very densely quilted. So clearly the effort and highlight was put into this handkerchief. And you kind of have to wonder, not knowing the history of why she created it, but knowing that there was that connection to Benedict Arnold and the Revolution. Was she trying to express some loyalty, a patriotism in creating this quilt, and kind of maybe distancing herself from her infamous family member? And we might never know her motivation, but the fact that that center was so intricately quilted compared to the rest of the quilt kind of makes you wonder if that was her motivation for making this beautiful quilt.
This next quilt is done about the same time, circa 1830, by Mehitable Wood of Gloucester, Massachusetts. And the center is also a commemorative handkerchief as a central medallion. It has the British warship Leopold and an American warship, the Chesapeake. And then it's a little difficult to see, but all 4 corners have illustrations of Thomas Jefferson on the outside. So it's a fairly simple piecing. The original center is framed with bars of 4 patch blocks at the corners and then surrounded by a row of 4 patch on point. The backing is a plain cotton, and it, like some of the other quilts we've mentioned, has Mehitable Wood's signature rather than cross stitch, but it does have cross stitch letters I, B, and number 6. We'll never know exactly what that was, whether it was her sheet and it was number 6 of the sheets, we don't know. And then it also has a T shape with rounded corners, but it's a little interesting. It's not square, it's mitered so that hopefully would match perfectly when it was on the bed for which it was made. And in our next slide, we're going to see another quilt made from a handkerchief, but this time the entire quilt is the handkerchief. It's a cradle size quilt thought to be made by Mary Peppers from Medfield, Massachusetts, somewhere 1810 to 1830. It's another really charming example of a handkerchief quilt. This one, the handkerchief itself is block printed, possibly English or Indian, and the backing is a fancy striped calico. The quilting is mostly outlining with some trellis work between the flowers, and the focus of the design is most definitely the handkerchief itself. I'm going to let Rebecca tell you another little secret we have here.
So the handkerchief is actually one of 3 handkerchiefs that were chosen. We've been working with Burnley and Trowbridge for a little while now on bringing a few reproductions again to our gift store. These are the 3 handkerchiefs that were chosen, so you can see the paisley. We pulled hard for the paisley because who doesn't love a good paisley? But part of it was very selfishly motivated because knowing that we had this fantastic cradle quilt in our collection, wouldn't it be wonderful for the program out in the village that visitors can come see to be able to make a reproduction of this cradle quilt using a very similar color scheme, so that really some of the very slight differences between the cradle quilt and the paisley handkerchief that we have are just slight color differences and very slight detail differences. So those are certainly available now, and I have to say the paisley one is my absolute favorite. I love those colors together. And speaking of favorites, we've now come full circle to the end of our very whirlwind tour through our quilts in the collection. And I mentioned way back at the beginning that generally speaking, our collection focuses on the years from 1790 to 1840, with a few exceptions. I have to say, Jean and I collectively made a slight exception to that rule by taking this crazy quilt, which is certainly well outside of that 1840 time period. And again, thinking through some of the popular quilting patterns, this has its craze, pardon the pun there, in the late 19th century. So 1880s, 1890s, these crazy quilts are being made in quantities. They're really interesting pieces. So this one is not a quilt. It's not quilted together, it's tied. It is pieced, probably hand pieced. And then in between each of those crazy pieces is beautiful silk embroidery. The pieces themselves, a lot of them are beautiful silks and velvets interspersed with embroidered designs, nature. We've got a stag in one and flowers in another. A lot of them also incorporate painted designs as well. Again, a lot of natural designs. And these quilts tend to be very fragile inherently, especially some of those silks which had additives to them by the late 19th century that gave them extra weight and texture, but also made them incredibly brittle and very prone to shattering. And the velvets too tended to wear, and that pile would just wear away. So this quilt, the fact that it's come to us in such fantastic condition, really makes it kind of a nice bookend to our quilt collection as a whole. It's probably from Rhode Island, and again, one of the neat things about these quilts, and tying back into the sentimentality, is this quilt incorporates some silk ribbons, commemorative ribbons. So there's one for the Lincoln Republican Association of Central Falls, Rhode Island, that's dated 1888, 250th anniversary of the incorporation of Dedham School in 1886, another one for the Independent Order of Oddfellows encampment at Rocky Point in the 1880s. So that helps us place it in not only the time, but also the geographical location as well. And it is definitely all about the piecing and all of those fabrics that are being used in this luxury. These are quilts that, generally speaking, are pieces that weren't necessarily made to go on the bed and have that heavy use that some of the other quilts that you've seen tonight, but were very much designed to be shown and be seen in the household. So that again is a very whirlwind tour through some of our favorite quilts in the collection from the early 18th, rather the late 18th century through the late 19th century. And I think we have just a few minutes left over for any questions that folks might have.
Thank you both so much for that wonderful presentation. We do have a few questions, and I will pull them up here. So one we have is, how were the quilting lines put on the whole cloth quilts? Today we would use pencil lines, but that wouldn't have shown up on the blue whole cloth quilts.
So one thing that you might try on something like the dark blue is to use a chalk like a tailor's chalk to make the lines. So the lighter color of a light blue or white would show up much better than the pencil.
And kind of tied to that question too, how did they get such perfect designs? Were they using any like stamps or anything like that?
That's a great question. Would you like to answer that or would you like me?
Oh, you can. I was just thinking one thing that we didn't include. We also have quilting adjacent things, including quilts templates and patterns. So it could be as simple as some of those scalloped patterns, just using a saucer or a teacup and tracing that over and over again, or a simple straight edge to get some of those grids. But we do have some quilting patterns in the collection that are serpentine, or we have a leaf pattern that was made out of an anti-slavery pamphlet. So there certainly are some patterns and templates around for creating some of these designs, but I'm sure Jean can add to that.
Sure. And another option might be to take something like a pasteboard, a heavy cardboard, and sew on some cording or piping and make it into the design. I'm thinking of one that we have that's almost a rope design. And so it's sewn on, and then that could be chalked and then gently put down onto the quilt. The other thing that might be a little different is we might today want to mark the entire quilt at once. You might be actually starting in the center, marking just that part, because a lot of these chalks could be easily rubbed off with your arm as you're working. And so mark that section and work all the way to one side, go back to the middle and work your way to the other side.
So we have a kind of a vocab question. So what is a counterpane?
It's actually another name for something that we might call like a summer bedspread. So it's not necessarily quilted. It could be a nice heavy cotton printed fabric, but it's made as a light covering to go on a bed.
So this is kind of a hard question because it's hard to know, but how long do you think it would take someone to quilt a large quilt like that?
That's a really good question. And it's like you said, it's hard to know because a lot of times folks aren't putting things into their diaries and day books in terms of quantities. They'll mention that they're working on it over the course of, a few days, a few weeks, but not saying I spent 30 minutes working today and 30 minutes working. But I will say a lot of these quilts, not necessarily the whole cloth white work quilts and some of those where it's clearly one person's hand quilting the entire thing. But in a more practical sense, you might piece the quilt together, baste it with the batting and the backing, put it on a quilting frame, and then invite friends over for a quilting. And so people are coming together and working on this one piece or multiple pieces in the same day with music and refreshments and conversation. So you might be able to quilt the actual quilting part of it relatively quickly with some help like that. I'm sure Jean can add to that too.
Exactly what Rebecca was saying. And so there are instances of people like ladies' charitable societies getting together to make quilts, which they actually meant a petticoat or bed quilts on one day and working almost like a relay team. So as Rebecca was mentioning, some people are reading to you while you're working, other people are having refreshments and tea, and then you trade places at the frame. So you might have 6 or 8 people working at once, but throughout the day. And it's not unheard of for them to finish a simple quilting pattern in one day.
Sounds like a fun group activity, honestly.
It does. It does.
We have a thank you. It says, thank you, ladies. Lovely presentation. We must do more of these. It was very interesting and informative. And we plan on doing more of these. So yes. Another question we have is, do you have any whole cloth quilts that were documented to be marked by a professional quilt marker?
We do not have any that are documented to a professional quilt maker, unfortunately. That would be a wonderful thing to have. Which actually brings us to one thought that we were having as we're putting this together. Document your quilts, everybody. one thing that makes these quilts so special to us as a museum is the history, the known maker, the location, the story behind it. And so that's one thing that we always tell folks, make sure you are documenting your quilt, have a label on it, keep that story with it, because 200 years from now, your quilt may also be in a museum collection.
That is all the questions I have. If you guys have any other questions, feel free to add them. We do have a little extra bit of time. If not, and if you would like to email us any questions, we have an email address on the screen here, collectionsandresearch@osv.org. And if you guys would like to look at more of our quilt collection, we've been photographing it over the course of the last year and we'll be continuing next year as well. And all of that is available on our online database at collections.osv.org. So that's it. We don't seem to have any more questions. So thank you both so much for this lovely presentation, and thank you all for joining us tonight. If you did not catch the entire program or you would like to share it, a recording of this webinar will be sent to our members and it will be available on our YouTube page as well in a week. And again, feel free to look at our YouTube page and to go on to our collections database. I hope everyone has a great evening. Bye.